Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier of the Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, and I'd like to provide some information that should be helpful as you are working through the materials for Week 8 of the Contracts 1 course. Keeping in mind, we started with and are finishing in Week 8, the first main section of Contracts 1, which is formation. That's the offer, the acceptance, the sufficient specificity of essential terms. It's quite a lot of S's there. And consideration being the fourth primary component of contract formation. In the last several weeks, we have discussed what consideration is and how you gauge it, sufficiency and possibly adequacy. We have considered last week what consideration may not be. There are certain things that do not rise to the level of consideration, and if that's the case, we do not have a formed contract. We might have a gift, we might have some other situation, but not a formed contractual relationship. Last week, though, at least a few points, we covered certain things that traditionally may have lacked consideration, but courts have seemed to find a way to fudge, for example, the consideration for public policy reasons to save the deal. And often that's dealt with in the law of equity by finding a consideration substitute. In other words, there is a lack of common law traditional consideration which could prevent contract formation. However, it is unfair that we do not find some form of contract in this case, and therefore we can take that problem or some activity in relation to a problem and piece it together as the consideration substitute such that that element is in fact met, and assuming that the other three components are also met, we have a formed contract. And have we seen this before? In a way, we may have. As an example, when you see the implication of an option contract. If you have a unilateral contract where one party goes beyond mere preparation but begins to perform, we learned at common law, and if I'm correct, it's Restatement Second of Contracts, Section 87, Sub 2. We've learned that the law will imply an option contract so that the offeror cannot revoke the offer prior to the end of performance, in other words, giving the offeree who has begun performance a reasonable time to finish. If nothing else, that's a great example of an implied-in-law activity. It is an equitable action of the court to try and prevent the harsh results if we had just relied on the law and not added a little bit of equity to it. And so the concept here is that somebody can bring up a promissory estoppel argument based on detrimental reliance. And let me see if I can make that clear. It's a little bit complicated, a little bit subtle, but let's try. Estoppel, promissory estoppel, is when someone asks a court not to listen to the other side's argument. Please stop them from arguing this. It is not fair. Okay? So someone asks the court for equitable relief of promissory estoppel. Please, they may have a legal argument against me, but it's not fair. Don't listen to them and dismiss the case. That's the concept. Well, what would be an example of a reason to ask for promissory estoppel? And that would be detrimental reliance. For example, Your Honor, he said if I painted his garage, he would give me $3,000. It's a unilateral contract. I do understand that. Okay? But I painted 2/3 of it, and I've done a good job so far. And he's just walked up and thrown me off the job now, and it's so unfair. I didn't do anything wrong. I was doing everything on time. Even though he said performance is all I want, I took him at his word that he would at least act reasonably to give me the time to finish. And for some reason that is unrelated to my performance, he's tried to throw me off the job site, and it's not fair. I detrimentally relied on his good faith and his promise to pay me if I finished, and the implied idea that he would give me the time to finish, acting reasonably, which seems to have failed. And so legally, I didn't finish on time, and he threw me off, and under the common law rules of old, the offeror has the right to revoke an unilateral contract until full performance has been rendered. But in a kinder, gentler, and better world, we don't allow that anymore. We imply this. And so I argue, because I detrimentally relied on him, his promise to pay me, and I put so much work in, I detrimentally relied on his good faith and the ability to pay me by the time I finished, such that he should be prevented from arguing the lack of my final consideration to throw me off the job before I have a chance to finish. In other words, I'm asking the court to promisorially stop his argument that there's no consideration, and legally there's not really, because I haven't finished yet. And in the unilateral contract, consideration is the finished product, not partial. But I'm asking because I detrimentally relied based on his assertions and promises that I could finish. He should be stopped from arguing because I relied on him, and it's just not fair. Okay? You can imagine how in the old days the law was relatively strict and there would be a lack of consideration, but you learned over the course of time, courts have tried to soften those harsh legal rules under appropriate circumstances. And as I just explained with this garage example, the painting of the garage, I think it makes the point. Okay? So there's no consideration. It's not their right consideration, but the court's going to stop the offeror from arguing that because it's just not fair. Okay? And the cases that we cover in Class 8 deal with that. There are cases that follow an historical progression of where the court has determined that there is a legal absence of consideration, and yet we're going to use the concept of detrimental reliance and the doctrine of promissory estoppel to supply it, to substitute for the consideration, such that a party can actually enforce a contract. We have a formed contract that has obligations on both sides. And where do we see it first? Charitable gifts. And I think that's the first case that we cover in Class 8. Someone makes a promise to pay $1,000 to a charity. Okay? What is the other side giving back? Nothing. Technically, nothing. Okay? So courts have stretched and said, well, the charity has promised to write a nice article in the newspaper about the gift. It's going to have a luncheon to respect the people who gave the gift. Courts have tried to find something that the other side would do, because truly we have a gratuitous promise. The other side's not doing anything, but public policy wants to favor donations to charitable organizations. So it began to try and find ways, and one would be, well, this is a case of consideration substitutes. Did the charity rely in any way on the promise of this gift? If it did, then that reliance we were going to call a consideration substitute. Okay? In the example given, I think that the school, the ecumenical school at issue, had written words in a thank you card. It had begun sending out information with regard to the scholarship, and so it did actually undertake, at least to a minimal level, some activity based on the likelihood that that charitable gift would have been honored. By the way, again, if I'm correct, the lady who made the promise died, and it's her estate trying to keep the money and arguing that there was no consideration on the other side, and therefore no contract and no enforceable gift. Let's see. I've already talked about the unilateral contract idea, where somebody makes an offer, it's unilateral, and the other side takes the person at his or her word and begins significantly to perform. It would be really unfair for the offeror to step in and revoke before performance has been finalized. And you see that perhaps best in Restatement Second of Contracts, Section 87, Subsection 2, or it might be in 90. We'll talk about that when we're in class. Okay? Another special situation where you see this consideration substitutes or promissory estoppel is in the case of the use of subcontractors. Subcontractors will perhaps put in a bid to a big contractor who uses those smaller bids to make his or her big bid. What if a subcontractor backs out and says, I can't do it for $10,000, it's got to be $30,000. But this contractor has already put in a bid relying on the subcontractor's estimation of $10,000. Now, if this subcontractor backs out, you could find the contractor bound to a bad contract and, in other words, end up losing $20,000. So we say that a subcontractor, even without special consideration, a subcontractor who knows the bid's going to be used in another bid is stopped from arguing the lack of consideration. And he or she has to leave it open until such time as that contract has been awarded or been denied, and then the parties can, of course, move away. But you see there where the subcontractor who wants to walk away or perhaps threaten to get more money is stopped from doing that because the contractor detrimentally relies on that price to make his total bid. And if he wins, he's stuck with that total bid price. Okay? So there's a special situation where you see the consideration substitute this detrimental reliance by a contractor on a subcontractor's bid. One of the interesting things with regard to promissory estoppel in subsection 90, there is a big difference between the first restatement and the second restatement. Both of them say if one party makes assertions and promises and a bargain and the other side has the reasonably believed right or has a reasonable expectation to continue and finish, right? Reasonable reliance is the idea. One party makes a promise. For example, if you paint the garage, $3,000. The other party has reasonably relies on that promise of payment to substantially begin work. Then the person, through this doctrine of based on the detrimental reliance, the offeror can be promissorily stopped from backing out. Okay, based on that, the person should finish and have the right to get paid. Well, the first restatement said that the other party trying to revoke in this unilateral situation where there's detrimental reliance wouldn't be able to do that. In other words, the contract would be fully formed. Whatever they agreed on one side, then the other with the consideration was how the rest of the contractual relationship would operate. Okay, for example, to finish the garage and collect the entire $1,000 or whatever the price was for the painting of the garage. The restatement second changes the language and says courts, when they see this injustice, can change the contractual relationship, can find consideration to bind a contractual relationship up to that point necessary to avoid injustice. So as under, if it's paint my garage for $1,000, under the first restatement, if the offeror tried to walk away and the offeror came back and said, hey, it's not fair, I need to finish and get my $1,000, the court would honor that. The consideration would be filled by the substitute, right, of detrimental reliance, and therefore the offeror would be stopped from claiming no consideration. And the person could finish and get his or her $1,000. The restatement second allows the court to alter the award. And it could be, for example, he told me when I was 2/3 done, that means I deserve roughly $670 up to now. I'd like to finish, but, and the court could say, fine, the contract is backed by consideration up to the amount necessary to prevent injustice. So, painter, you walk away, you have plenty of jobs that you can go do tomorrow. So you're not out of work if you don't finish this. If you walk away, though, you should get 2/3 of what the price was because you've done 2/3 of the work. Therefore, we will say the contract is backed by consideration up to the 2/3. So you walk away now, get a new job, and the person who contracted with you has to pay the 2/3, which is about $667. So you see the first one was the full contract, the full amount. And the restatement second now, it's the up to the extent necessary to prevent injustice. Your authors of the casebook make that point, and I think it's a good idea to keep an eye on how the law changes over time. You see how it was one way and it's become even more reasonable perhaps, or more flexible. And that's a part of the game of learning contracts law, is where the courts were, where they are, and where perhaps they're going. Unfortunately, perhaps, the law is not static, and so you have to keep in mind trends and where you think that things are going. Okay? I will see everyone in class for Class 8.